So, hi, my name's Aaron Johnsen. We'll get into a little bit about who I am and what I am, but today I'm here to talk about lawn diseases with a specific focus on residential lawn diseases. So, what we see going on in really lawns and residential lawns. So, a little bit more about me. I've got my bachelor's and master's really in turf science. I went to the University of Minnesota for that. Along the way, I also stumbled my way into an MBA, but the main part of my career, the main part that makes me qualified to talk on this topic is I had a little over 10 years of work in technical services, sales, and marketing, working across kind of all our different industries: lawn care, golf courses, pest control companies, and such. And for the last 5 years, I've been the co owner of a company called BioLawn. We are based in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, and our focus is on residential lawn care and really high end residential lawn care. So, in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about disease, right? Why does disease happen? What are some of the common diseases we see in home lawns? This is going to be a little more tilted towards cool season grasses, just because those are the main ones that get the diseases. We're also going to talk about what can be done once a disease happens, right? And in home lawns, we're often dealing with it after it's been observed, typically not before. But we will dive a little bit into how we can prevent this as well. So I start with a story. This is Pat's lawn. I was out on Pat's lawn earlier this summer, late July, to take a look, and she had some disease. And we're going to come back to this disease and what was going on and this customer's experience as we go through the year. But one thing I want to talk about real quick here is this is a street view photo. For those of you that don't know, you can go into the past on Street View for Google, and you're going to see that as we go here, and it shows some enlightening things. So, to start, I always like to start with a definition. Today, we're going to start with what is a disease. That is, a pathogen, in this case, specifically a fungus, that disrupts a plant's normal functioning and typically will lead to visual symptoms. Now, I think it's important to understand there are good fungi and there are bad fungi. And we'll talk a little bit about what those different ones mean for the lawn because we do see both in home lawns. Now, when we talk about disturbing plant mechanisms and normal plant processes, this is really what we're talking about. Depending on the disease, the fungus, it could disturb the plant's metabolism, interrupting things like enzyme production or growth regulator production, changing how that plant grows. Some diseases and funguses absorb food from the host, so that takes away what the grass might have for itself. And others will block those flow mechanisms in the plants from the xylem to the phloem, right? So the main thing here is we're going to disturb the normal plant function. That's what a fungus is going to do. And in turn, what happens is we see a visual disturbance of that lawn. That lawn does not look as good as it normally would. So these are all different images of disease, right? But this is that visual appearance. And, if we didn't have this visual appearance, I don't think most people would worry about disease in their lawn. But when they get these impacts of brown grass, circles, mycelium, or the white stuff growing on the grass, people get concerned. Now, disease is often blamed for a lot of things, and there's a lot of other cases of where disease doesn't actually occur. So, in the upper left here, we've got a fertilizer spill, or we may have tire tracks left by a machine, or we may have drought from a tree or from just lack of rain, right? Or we may have, a situation where class 5 was left in the ground. So, sometimes disease does get blamed for something that really isn't disease based. But the flip also happens, right? We blame it on drought when it really is disease. So, just I think something interesting to keep in mind is what are all those things happening and how do we inflict and diagnose and determine what to do from there. So these are common statements I hear all the time, right? I've never had a disease before. Why do I have it and my neighbors don't? I've never had this disease until you started doing my lawn. What are you going to do to fix it? I have an event next week. This is unacceptable. It needs to look good. So all kinds of different things happen, or thoughts go through homeowners' heads when they get a disease. And we're going to start with talking about how and why, right? How and why does a disease happen? And I put this statement up because, in my experience, most homeowners don't care about the how or the why. But I think it's still helpful to know. And as I talk through this, I'll talk about kind of my process for getting customers through the how and the why. So the how and the why really starts with something called the disease triangle. And so several of you might have seen this before. The idea behind the disease triangle is that the pathogen, the host, and the environment have to be perfect or have to be in a line for the disease to happen. So today we're going to talk about, what has to happen for the pathogen to cause disease, what happens for the host to cause disease, and what has to happen for the environment to cause disease. Now, I do have kind of my own triangle that I've talked about before, which does overlap with the disease triangle. And that is what I call the perfect lawn triangle, right? And that is, us as an applicator have to apply good treatments. The homeowner or who's ever doing the maintenance has to provide the proper care, the proper watering, the proper mowing, and then you have to have good weather. And so, like the disease triangle, if any one of these items is out of whack, we can lose the perfect lawn. Just like if we have the pathogen, the host, and the environment, if one of those is out of whack, we're then generally not going to get disease. So we talk about that first category, the pathogen, right? And this comment from homeowners always happens. I've never had this disease before. Where did it come from? And the reality is, diseases or funguses exist in a dormant state almost all the time, right? If you go to most home lawns, you're going to be able to find one of these dormant states, right? And those dormant states happen to be spores, mycelium in infected tissue, sclerotia, soil, or maybe an alternative host. But when someone says, I've never had this disease before, where did it come from? The answer typically is it was already there. It was just waiting for the right host and the right environment. Obviously, homeowners don't like to hear that, but I think it's important to know that most likely the disease was already there. There are ways that the disease can be brought in, things like wind, insects, animals, water, machinery, plant debris, bringing in, say, mulch or something like that. And again, these do happen, right? So those fungal dormant states can travel on insects, can travel on animals, can travel in water. So sometimes the disease wasn't present and something brought it in. And so it's important to unpack that. The reality here is finding out where the pathogen came from is pretty difficult and probably above what you really need to do when we're talking about residential disease identification. The reality is that at the point that you see it, you already have it. So it kind of doesn't matter where it came from. And the reality is most likely it was there. So when we talked about this homeowner, Pat, who had said, I've never seen this disease before in your home lawn, I had talked about going on Google Street View and looking in prior years. So I was able to do that with this homeowner. And it turns out the year before, which in 2023, they did not have us hired for lawn care. The year before, they had the same disease, same issues going on with their front lawn. So it's not like they didn't have it before. But I think this is an important point, right? People's memories are short. And so they're not going to remember that last year they had it. A lot's happened since then. And so they want to blame somebody, they want to blame something. But the reality is, if we go back far enough in time, we're likely going to see that lawn had this problem at some other time in the past, right? And that's where Google Street View can come in, can be very helpful to identifying when and where and what might have happened. So then we talk about the host, right? That is the plant, that is the lawn. And again, this statement, I've never had this disease before. Why do I have it and not my neighbors? That's a common comment I get. And there are other reasons, but one of those reasons could be the species or cultivar that you might be growing in your lawn versus a neighbor or someone down the street, right? And It's very easy to talk about the species difference. Kentucky bluegrass going to be susceptible to root diseases and leaf diseases, but not so much Pythium. Perennial ryegrass more susceptible to foliar diseases, not so much the root diseases. Tall fescue again less susceptible to the root diseases, more susceptible to leaf diseases. And then fine fescue, same thing, right? More susceptible to leaf than root. So we can talk about species differences, and those definitely exist. There are also, and probably the bigger one that really focuses on in a given region is the cultivar differences, right? In the Twin Cities, most people are growing Kentucky bluegrass fine fescue lawns, and those cultivar differences are pretty huge, right? Within Kentucky bluegrass, there's a wide range of disease resistance. And I'll call out the NTEP program for anybody who might not be familiar with it. You can go look at the disease ratings on different varieties. And so sometimes selecting better varieties, and we'll talk about that when we talk about how to solve disease problems, can be a big difference. But when we talk about my neighbors don't have it and I do, why? One of the reasons often is the type of grass we're growing. Now let's get back to Pat. So that was one of the lines Pat used with me earlier this year. Why do I have it and my neighbors don't? And she was talking about this neighbor over here. And it's kind of funny. She led herself into the answer. She made a comment, they never treat their weeds. That's why we have a lot of weeds. They don't water their grass, so it always looks bad. They don't mow it often, so it looks worse. They don't do anything to take care of it. You know, why don't they like their lawn like I do? And the reality is the lack of the neighbor taking care of their lawn. I would say 50% plus of their lawn was crabgrass. It was, and then beyond that, it was weeds and it was all kinds of Heinz 57 of varieties, right? And so when we look at Pat's lawn, which was more uniform Kentucky bluegrass and fine fescue, she got the disease, but the neighbor who had a wide variety and a lot of warm season grass didn't have the problem, right? So that cultivar aspect of what are they growing can lead to differences. The final one, and the one that the homeowner, that us as applicators really have the most control over, is the environment, right? So, as I talked before, that pathogen, that disease, that fungus is most likely already in the soil. And even if it isn't, you're probably not going to stop it from coming over to that lawn. Same thing, the grass is already there, right? So, there are some long term strategies, but in the short term, you're not going to change the type of grass you're growing. So, environment is really the thing that we control. And from an applicator standpoint, there are two things I'll point out is the fertilization side, right? Over and under fertilizing. And when we get to specific diseases here, we'll talk about what that means for specific diseases. But just keep in mind that some diseases like excess nitrogen, some like low nitrogen. So that is something we as applicators have control over. Other things in the environment that can cause disease include overwatering, poor drainage, excessive thatch, low mowing heights, high mowing heights, dull mowers, traffic, the list kind of goes on. What I really want to point out here is most of this is on the homeowner. So when we think back to that perfect long triangle, we as applicators can do everything right. Even the weather can be pretty good, but the homeowner, if they're not watering right or not mowing right, can induce disease to happen on their lawn. So I think it's just something important to know, especially as we talk about this homeowner education side of things and how do we get them to help us make that perfect lawn, that disease-free lawn. Mowing and watering are two of those big things. Then there's the environmental side that we don't really have control over, right? That is too much rain, that is high humidity or high temperatures, or sometimes even low temperature. That's dew periods. So anything to do with the environment, and most often with lawn diseases, it's going to be water, high temperatures, and humidity, right? Anything that causes those is going to induce more disease. Now, shade, where we have lack of air movement, lack of light, those things also can help induce disease. So there's a lot within this environmental aspect that we can control. And then there's the time of year, right? That's kind of environmental. So this is a list of diseases here on the left, and then the different months across the year. And these bars show when it infects. And so some of this also is about time of year, meaning you can have the perfect conditions um, for a disease, but at the wrong time of year, the chance of getting it is a lot less. So we'll talk through again time of year with some of these diseases as well as we go through this presentation. So when we talk about, excuse me, the environmental aspect with Pat's lawn here, um, weather-wise, we had, humidity, we had warmer temperatures, and we had a lot of rain. So the weather on the environment side wasn't doing us a lot of favors. The customer wasn't doing us a lot of favors in that they were watering even more, trying to have a green lawn, and they were mowing pretty short. They were mowing at about an inch and a half, right? So, some might argue they were looking for that golf course like lawn, but they were doing things from a watering and from a mowing standpoint that kind of helped the disease along. So, in this case, we had a pathogen, we had a host, we had an environment created by the homeowner, and we had the right weather of high humidity and high temperatures to induce disease to happen on this lawn. So the disease triangle is really the fundamental basis of trying to explain why disease might happen, right? And while the homeowner might not care, we definitely want to understand why it happens so we can get to preventing it. So those three aspects are we've got to have the pathogen present, we've got to have a host that's susceptible to that fungus, and then we've got to have the right environment, right? And so when we look at the perfect lawn example, and a perfect lawn we'll define as not having disease, we as applicators can do everything in the good treatments world, right? But then the homeowner cannot have the proper care, or we cannot have good weather, which then leads to not a perfect lawn and lots of disease, right? So this perfect lawn example really fits under environment and cultivating and creating that environment for the perfect lawn. So next I'm going to talk about what disease does my lawn have, right? And so, we may be able to explain why the disease occurred, um, but it's important to understand what disease do we actually have, right? If we're going to get to managing that disease, preventing that disease, we need to talk about what disease does that lawn have. And, some people bucket these by, root diseases and leaf diseases. Within the residential home lawn space, I like to define them as killing diseases, non-killing diseases, and decomposers, right? And so this is just a list of some of those diseases that fall into those different categories. And we're going to talk about most of these today. We've got killing diseases, non-killing diseases, and decomposers. So when we talk about killing diseases, there's a few main tenets that go across all the killing diseases. They're often root infecting. So they're not going to start on the leaves. They're going to start at the roots, and they're going to move up, and the leaves will become blighted or tan or yellow later on in the infection. So unfortunately, once you start to see those blighted leaves, you're often too late with a killing disease. The other thing most killing diseases have in common is they're going to form patches. And I should say, the main concern here and the main reason we talk about them in this light is they are going to kill the grass. So the grass will not naturally grow out of these. We are going to need to do something to get grass growing back in those spots, whether that be seeding or sodding or something else. So the first killing disease I want to talk about is necrotic ring spot. Necrotic ring spot is going to primarily infect bluegrass lawns. The infection occurs in April and May. So the infection is going to occur typically more in cooler soils, but wet is the main factor here, right? So in the spring, we're not often going to be able to control the soil temperature, but water, again, may not be easily controlled with rain, but if we have a lack of rain or you're able to hold back in irrigation, you might be able to stem the infection on this one, but it's going to happen in cool to wet soils. The challenge here with necrotic ring spot, and like I said, with most of these killing root type diseases, is we don't see the visual symptoms until later in the summer, until June or July, right? And at that point, the infection has already happened. Now, what does that look like? They call these a frog eye pattern. They're about the size of a dinner plate, and there's going to be a green, patch surrounded by a brown, yellow ring, right? So that grass is dead in that ring, and ultimately will need to be seeded or sodded to repair that. As far as control, again, may be difficult, but watching and monitoring irrigation, just making sure the grass has adequate nutrient and nitrogen, not too much, not too little. I think most people have designed a solid program around that. If you want to stop this disease, preventative fungicides are really the way. And the reason for that is that infection is going to happen before you kind of have it. So often we see lawns that get it one year. In, I guess, future years, we start to use preventative fungicides to prevent that from happening. And here's just a look at some other visual cues of what necrotic ring spot can look like. Again, mostly going to see this on bluegrass lawns. The next one I'm going to talk about is summer patch. Summer patch is again going to infect bluegrass and fine fescue lawns. This one's going to infect in May and June and be visible in July. So that pattern of a root infecting, killing type disease infecting earlier in the year and then being visible later in the year sticks with summer patch, just like necrotic ring spot. Again, you're going to get that frog-eyed pattern, and it's typically going to kill the grass. So, necrotic ring spot is very well known for the distinct frog eye. Summer patch, you kind of see versions of it. The other thing with summer patches, they're typically going to get larger patches than, say, the size of a dinner plate. But distinguishing between the two can definitely be difficult. And the reality, considering the control methods and the resultant of the grass dying, we're going to have the same, kind of really doesn't matter, I guess, is what I'm getting at there. So again, watering and avoiding overwatering here is important. Aerification can help. Specifically, why aerification can help with summer patch and even necrotic ring spot is you can get more water infiltrating through the soil, so it doesn't sit in the root zone layer of the grass. And then preventative fungicides, again, because we're going to see it visibly well later after it's infected. So if we know a lawn has summer patch, we're going to want to treat it earlier in the spring. The next one I want to talk about is Pythium. Pythium is universal to warm season and cool season grasses. This is going to be a killing disease again. Moisture is the key here. Lots of moisture, and I should have put it up here, but typically high temperatures is going to lead to more disease. As far as controlling it, irrigation management and reducing that excess water, preventative fungicides, again, because once you see it, that grass is dead. And then just avoiding high nitrogen. Really, the answer there is luscious green growing grass. We want the grass to be moderately growing, not excessively growing if we're going to reduce Pythium. And again, just some images here of grass infected with Pythium. And obviously, this is going to die or has died and is going to need to be reseeded or sodded. The next one we'll talk about is gray leaf spot. So gray leaf spot is going to happen in high nighttime temperatures, high humidity, high nitrogen, right? So again, these aspects of gray leaf spot and Pythium are somewhat similar in that high nighttime temp, high humidity, and high nitrogen. Stress turf, and this probably should be said for all diseases, anytime that grass is under stress, it's going to be more susceptible to disease. So reducing that stress, whether it be sunlight or mowing or lack of water, any number of things that can cause stress on grass. Gray leaf spot's a little bit unique in that it's going to primarily target perennial ryegrass. So if you have that, you might be susceptible to this. If you don't, chances of getting this are very low. Controlling gray leaf spot, you're going to look at lowering your nitrogen rates. You want to manage that water, and you want to manage uh, those diseases. So the similarity here among all the uh, killing diseases is going to be excess water, right? Some infect in cool temperatures, some infect in warm, but most of these are brought on by excess water. So we'll get to control methods later, but the big thing I just want to hit on at this moment is reducing overwatering from irrigation, improving drainage so that the excess rains that we might get will move through the soil. So next we're going to talk about non-killing diseases. So these diseases typically infect the leaves. So different than the killing diseases, which affect the roots, these are going to affect the leaves. They're going to cause your leaves to lose color, right? Turn a brown or tan color. But the key with the non-killing diseases is the crown is still alive, right? The growing point of the grass is still alive. And so with time, with proper care, with some of the things we'll talk about, the grass can actually grow out of these non-killing diseases. So that is the win with these, and probably the more preferred thing to get in a home lawn. So brown patch typically affects tall fescue. It's distinguished by kind of a smoke ring, and you can kind of really see that in this picture, especially early in the morning when the dew is there. It's going to look a little bit of a smoky ring. Brown patch is going to infect in higher nighttime temperatures. So when temps are above 70 degrees, again, leaf wetness and high nitrogen. So from a control standpoint, we can lower our nitrogen rates to kind of manage this disease. Again, managing excess moisture and fungicides here can slow this disease down. But the key here with this one is, while it looks like many of the root infecting diseases are killing diseases, from a standpoint of when it affects temperatures and leaf wetness, this will generally not kill the grass unless it's an extreme case. And again, just a few more examples, and here you can kind of see that smoke ring growing around that edge. Red thread. So red thread was our most popular disease up here in Minnesota this year. It really was brought on by a cooler summer and a lot of moisture. So normally in the Twin Cities, in the northern climates, you're going to see this in May and early June, and then you're going to see it again in September. This year we saw it all year, but normally you're going to see it a little bit on those shoulders. What distinguishes this is these pink or red strands that grow on the grass. This is the mycelia, and you can see it, especially again early in the morning with dew. This brings up a good point. I said it with brown patch, but anytime you're trying to identify disease, if you can get out there in the earlier morning hours when the dew is on the grass, you're going to have a much better chance of seeing some of the fungus actually growing, and you're going to be able to better identify it. Another tenet of red thread, it's going to bleach that grass. It's not going to kill that crown. So this grass will recover when the conditions kind of alleviate or go away. As far as managing red thread, you want to increase your nitrogen rates. And you're going to see that comment a lot with these leaf diseases. Many of the non-killing diseases actually need some more nitrogen. Managing, again, excess moisture, and fungicides if you really want to go that route. So here's just some other examples of red thread growing in lawns. Ascophyta. Ascophyta might be my least favorite disease, but on the flip, probably my most favorite disease, right? And that's really due to the lack of information about what brings on the disease and how to manage the disease. So, in my experience, I typically see it in later June, July, and early August. So it's going to infect in warmer weather. The challenge here is there's no specific shape. And in fact, you often see more distinct lines, like from machines or from footprints. And that's because this disease is a secondary infector, meaning it needs some other stressor to happen to cause it, right? And so we often, my most common answer to why we see this is mowing, and you can see that down here in this photo, mowing lines. Um, for whatever reason, mowing causes that stress that allows Ascophyta to get in. So when it comes to control, avoiding afternoon mowing, we constantly harp on our customers here not to mow in the afternoon during the summer. Just wait. Like the grass could grow another 2 inches. It's okay. Just wait. And probably the most troubling thing about Ascophyta is there's no fungicide. So there's no preventative program that's known to work to keep this out. And so homeowner goes from nice, good lawn to ugly looking lawn really quickly. And that's why this disease is kind of fascinating, troubling, frustrating out there. And just a few more looks. I think the key with Ascophyta is it's brought on by stress. Mowing is the most common one. But for anyone that uses the ride-on spreader sprayers, you're going to definitely cause this from time to time in a home lawn. The next one we're going to talk about is dollar spot. Dollar spot, again, is an inflictor of all cool season grasses. We're going to see it when temperatures are above 65 degrees, especially those nighttime temperatures. You're going to get small, almost dollar coin size spots of grass. Uh, you're going to see that white mycelium in the morning. And this is where I talked about if you're trying to identify a disease, get out there in the morning to see what's going on, see what you can see. And then again, like these other leaf diseases, dollar spot prefers low nitrogen. Now, one other thing I'll mention that I didn't put up here is I see a lot more dollar spot in low mow grass or, grass that's been mowed too short. So, keeping that grass height higher generally has a good way of keeping the dollar spot down. As far as control, similar to these other leaf infecting diseases, we're going to want to increase our nitrogen. We're going to want to minimize leaf wetness. And then again, fungicides always become an option here. And then here's just a few more. This photo does a good job of showing some of that mycelium. And then if you get a leaf blade, this kind of hourglass-like look to the leaf where you've got green at the base and green at the top, but brown in the middle is very indicative of a dollar spot infection. The next one we're going to talk about is snow mold, pink and gray. It's going to infect during the winter months. So cold, wet weather is going to bring this on. We see it both under snow and even when snow isn't present. So it's not necessary that snow has to be there for this to occur. As far as control after the fact, lightly raking can help these areas recover. Again, this is not going to kill the grass. It's just going to make it look unsightly. There are preventative fungicide options, but those do need to be applied in the fall. And then again, just to look at some of the other snow mold diseases. And, obviously you're not going to go out in the morning to identify these, but getting on lawns early in the spring is a great way to kind of identify what snow mold is happening. All right, now we're on to another one we saw a lot this summer here in the Twin Cities. That is rust. Late summer, early fall infector. It's going to cause grass blades to go orange or yellow. We're often seeing this on overcast weather, warm nights with wet leaves, and low nitrogen. So again, like all the leaf diseases, increasing that nitrogen, using fungicides are an option. This is a case where there are some really good resistant varieties. So an overseeding program or getting new grass types growing in there can be effective to managing this disease. And again, just a few other looks at what's going on. Next, we get to powdery mildew. So these are white leaves on the grass. Going to happen typically in cooler, cloudy conditions, but we still need leaf wetness. We need some humidity to get that to go. And then again, this is going to happen because of that cloudy aspect in more shady areas with poor air circulation. So managing this disease looks like more shade tolerant resistant types, reducing moisture, and even increasing airflow and sunlight to an area. And again, just a few more looks at what that powdery substance looks like on the surface. Only a couple more diseases here to walk through. We've got leaf spot. So these are going to typically infect in the spring and fall, going to form lesions or spots on the leaves. Very common in bluegrass, but we see it in fine fescues. We see it in perennial ryegrass. Again, like all these leaf infecting diseases, these non-killing diseases, increasing the nitrogen rates, managing excess moisture, and then maybe fungicides to boot. So before we get to that last category of decomposers, let's just summarize these non-killing, mostly leaf diseases. Most important factor is the plant is going to live. It's going to eventually grow out of this unless the infection and the pressure is just so high. You're going to get yellow leaf blades, spots on these leaf blades, all kinds of different looks, but the main culprit is the leaf is yellow, it's not green. Control wise, we want to reduce the moisture. So anything we can do to increase air circulation, increase sunlight hitting these areas, reducing excess moisture overnight, like managing irrigation programs, will help keep the moisture down. And then increasing nitrogen rates will help keep these diseases away as well. Now we're going to talk about that last group. So we have killing diseases, non-killing diseases, and decomposers. What sets the decomposers apart is that they don't directly infect the grass. So they're not causing any harm to the grass per se. You just see the symptoms, you see the signs of them in the grass. So the first one of two to talk about is fairy ring. Fairy ring is a fungus decomposing organic matter in the soil. Here I show mushrooms, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, but they also cannot cause mushrooms. They can just cause dark green rings or dead rings. Like I said, those mushrooms are sometimes present. So from a control aspect, you can remove and replace the soil. And I know especially some golf courses have done that in the past to manage fairy ring. So if you remove the soil or remove the fungus, you can increase the fertility to kind of mask the symptoms. This works really well for those dark green rings. And then fungicides, helping get a fungicide down there, and wetting agents can also help manage fairy ring. So here's just some examples of where mushrooms are not present, right? But you get those dark green rings. And if we were to go in and fertilize this area, we're going to see a much better blend, or we're not going to see it. And down here in the left corner, we see some of those killing rings. Again, just the idea that fairy ring can represent itself in multiple manners. And then we talk about mushrooms. So, outside of fairy rings, there are mushrooms, again, that are just decomposing a plant material in the soil. They're often going to show up under moist conditions. And the way I differentiate mushrooms versus fairy ring is that these mushrooms are going to show up randomly in the lawn, not kind of in a nice ring. Fungicides here are generally not recommended as effective, but I know some people do try them. So here's just some examples of mushrooms in the lawn. So there's kind of this weird balance, I would say, with lawns and identifying the disease. And what I mean by that is, obviously, if you're experienced, if you're knowledgeable, you can identify the disease. There's also most labs or universities that have a turf program will be able to identify what specific disease you have. And that obviously can be helpful for designing a program. But I step back and I say most commonly, I just try to get the homeowner to, is this killing the grass? Is it not killing the grass? Or is it not really related to the grass at all in the form of decomposers? So, okay, I know I've got the disease. I've maybe identified and hopefully have what disease I have. Now we get to what can happen. How can we get it controlled? And the first thing I want to highlight is there's no immediate fix to the brown grass you see. We will talk about some actions to repair that grass that might provide an immediate fix. But when we're talking to the homeowner, the thing we want to communicate right away is you've had a disease. It's not going to be an immediate fix. There are actions, like I said, to repair the brown grass. There are actions to prevent the further spread. And then there's kind of actions we can take to limit the future occurrence. Now, this is where I tell you, I think it's really important to understand your customer's expectations before you start recommending. Some people don't want to spend a lot of money on their lawn. So talking about a multiple application fungicide program and trimming trees and overseeding and doing all kinds of stuff may not be within their budget or within their realm of expectation, right? Sometimes people want to just know what's happening. And so one of the things I'd encourage you to understand when you're talking to a homeowner is understand what their expectation is before you start kind of recommending things. So let's get back to Pat here. Pat's expectation was this lawn would be perfect, right? She was very understanding that it wasn't going to happen overnight, that we weren't going to get it growing green overnight, but her expectation was that it was going to happen rather quickly, that we were going to get there, and that her lawn would be happy. Now, unfortunately, in Pat's case, the infection continued because the weather continued. I'm not sure she took some of my recommendations, which we'll talk about. And so in this case, we probably had an unhappy client. But we'll get back to that in a minute. So, actions that can be taken to repair the brown grass, right? Sometimes applying extra fertilizer, especially when we talk about these leaf infecting, non killing diseases, a little bit of extra fertilizer is going to help stem off more of that disease happening and also help the lawn recover more quickly. So, applying extra fertilizer is sometimes the solution. The nice thing there is it also shows the customer you're taking some action to help them. Supplying adequate irrigation. And this is the word adequate is important here because we don't want to over irrigate, but sometimes these diseases happen right after rainfall, but the homeowner hadn't been watering their grass, and so their grass was stressed prior. So just making sure the irrigation is correct. Avoid mowing traffic. Like people mow too often, I think, and they mow too short, right? So if we can reduce the mowing, if we can raise our mowing height, it's going to give that grass less stress and going to help it grow out of it. Now, in the killing case, we're going to have to really talk about seed or sod to repair those areas. But even in the non-killing case, maybe sometimes we want to remove the host. We want to change the dynamics of that system. So seeding or sodding can definitely be part of that formula to improve that grass. And then there's paint. When I've got a party next week and this needs to look better, paint typically is your only option there for that instantaneous effect. So don't forget that that is a solution. And if we go back, if we understand what the customer's expectation is, we can most appropriately recommend what action to take. Then there's actions we can take to prevent the further spread. So here we're talking fungicides. And by further spread, I don't mean over the course of 3 months or 6 months or next year. What I'm really talking about is, okay, I have the disease today. How do I make sure tomorrow and the next day and the next day, this disease isn't spreading? And that's why I talk fungicides here, because we need some immediate fix, something to stop the disease. And if we're really understanding of what disease we have, we can understand, we probably need something that's going to be curative here, not preventative, because again, we're just trying this short window. I'm going to typically recommend sprays in this case because it's going to immediately get on the plant and into the plant, but granular can work, especially if you can manage that water. And then contact or systemic. So contacts are going to be a much quicker knockdown. I typically like to look at a blend of the two because I want that early few day knockdown, but I also don't want that disease coming back in 2 or 3 weeks. And then lastly, we have actions that can be taken to limit the occurrence in the future. And this is really where I want to focus on what should we be doing, right? That immediate short term needs to look like providing an answer to the customer, but most people will be happy, not if you solve the immediate problem, but if you prevent it in the future. So number one is changing the fertility program. And here it's just making sure your nitrogen rate is optimized for the time of year, the grass growth cycle, what's going on, so that the grass can be at least growing the best it can to keep the disease away. The next one, and this is a constant battle with homeowners, is their mowing height and not mowing in the afternoon, right? In my opinion, most homeowners mow way too short, and they mow when it's convenient, obviously for them, not when it's best for the grass. So here we can talk about education, but unless you're controlling that mowing, it's going to be pretty difficult to manage this one. But I've gone as far as changing the mowing height for them on their mower, right? Especially if they're open to it. Obviously, I wouldn't run into their garage and do it without them knowing. But changing that mowing height, helping them get to that right height. Changing their irrigation schedule, right? So we want to make sure they're watering at the right time, meaning we don't want to water at 9 or 10 or 11 at night. We want to water 5 to 7 a.m. We also don't want to water in the middle of the afternoon, right? So making sure they're watering at the right time, making sure they're watering deep and infrequent. The goal here is to make sure the leaf blade is dry. And kind of like the mowing situation, I've been known a time or two to go into someone's garage with them and change up their irrigation schedule, right? People often set those and forget them. And that's really not what's ideal to either preventing disease or helping recover from disease. So don't be afraid to take that on and work with them to adjust the irrigation schedule. Changing the environment. This is obviously a more longer term investment and going to require that homeowner to do something. But the two areas I like to focus on are improving the drainage, which can be done both through drains and through aeration. But doing something to make sure that water's getting off the leaf surface, out of the root zone, and down deeper into the soil is ideal. And then increasing air movement. Anything we can do with trimming trees, making more light and air get to that grass is again going to reduce that moisture and reduce that stress and improve that growing environment. Another big one is overseeding, reseeding, resodding, anything you can do to introduce new genetics. And this is kind of just an interesting chart here where it shows the disease on the left and the grass type or species above. And the more positive signs it has, the more susceptible it is to that disease, right? And so we can see, like if we talk snow mold, bluegrass and ryegrass are going to be more susceptible. So if this is a problem, introducing more tall fescue and fine fescue, right? And this idea that we're going to introduce species that are maybe less, inflicted by the disease happening in that lawn, but also then thinking about variety, right? So maybe they still want a bluegrass lawn, but we can do things to reduce the amount of that disease happening by selecting the right varieties. Now, to note, especially when we're talking about reseeding or overseeding areas, these areas take multiple years. So you've really got to sell the homeowner, and this is a long-term approach, multi-year. It's not like I reseed this fall and next year you don't get the disease, right? We've got to change that profile of that host over time. And then the last one, fungicides. If we're trying to limit the occurrence in the future, we're mostly going to use preventative fungicides because we know that disease is there now. We can use both granular and liquid because we have time. We have the fact that we can get those absorbed into the plant, and we're going to use more systemic disease controls because, again, we have that time aspect of being upfront with it. Now, let's just talk for a few minutes about designing a disease control program for residential lawns. So, to start, education is key, right? If the homeowner is competing against you because they're mowing too short or they're watering late at night or in the evening, it's going to be really hard for any disease program to hold up. So, when you're talking about this, you need to talk about the holistic approach and make sure that homeowner really understands what they need to be doing. Other important tenets in designing this program is fungicides need to be regularly applied during the infection period. So we're talking about a disease that occurs in the summer. Applying fungicides in the spring isn't going to do much for that disease. So we need to make sure we're applying fungicides at the right timing of the year. I think it's important to think of the fungicides as temporary protection, right? So in telling the homeowner, you're going to be on a fungicide program, you don't want to tell them this is going to stop all disease. You don't want to tell them that this is like a temporary protection for that plant, right? And chemical and rate are really going to determine that protection window. So selecting the right chemical and the right rate for your application interval is going to be key. And just think about this. There are fungicides that can give you 7 days or maybe even sometimes only 5 or 3 days of protection. And there are other ones that can give you 30 plus days. So Just keep that in mind when picking what you're going to do and how you're going to treat it. Granular versus liquid, I just point this out. Granular is going to be much more expensive. The convenience of granular might outweigh the cost of liquid. I can tell you for us at BioLawn, it does. We use a lot more granular in our fungicide programs just because of the convenience of throwing a bag on a tech's truck rather than having to have water and mixing and all that. And then lastly, I'll mention that fungicide rotation is important. So when designing this program, you're going to want to think about fungicide rotation. There's a lot of resources out there. I have a link at the end to a disease guide put out by the University of Kentucky where we lay out all the different diseases. So here in the middle, you can see large patch for zoysia. You can see all the fungicides, and they even talk about what type of fungicides they are, how well they work, and how often you need to apply. So some really good information out there. That Kentucky publication is one of my favorites for identifying what should we do. But note, you're going to have a lot of choices. So second comment I'll make in designing that control program for residential lawn is going to be, the IPM approach is important. So don't forget those environmental aspects. But then I really feel like there's two different approaches, right? Approach one is a program to cover most anything. And in this case, you're going to apply every 21 to 28 days, kind of monthly, roughly, throughout the season. You're going to use broader spectrum fungicides, often combination fungicides. And this is going to be ideal for the client who wants the perfect lawn, right? The one who says, I never want to see disease. I want a green, luscious grass all year long. Do whatever it takes. You can't kind of be caught without protection. So you're going to be doing this every 21 to 28 day treatment. Approach number two is specific treatments for specific diseases. So this is going to be ideal where either IPM is part of that, and that would be ideal, or cost is a consideration. We're not going to treat all year because we can't afford it. We're going to target a specific fungicide for a specific disease. In this case, timing is going to be really important, right? So for summer patch, we're going to look at 2 spring treatments. For brown patch, we're going to apply during hot, humid weather. We're going to time these treatments to the specific time of year. So for some of you out there, you can think of these two as the first one is a programmatic approach where it's almost like our lawn program. We're there monthly and we do whatever's needed based on that time of year. The second one is going to be more of a special service type treatment where I'm going after one disease and I sign you up for one program for just that disease. So that's a lot of information about disease. And we talked about a lot of ways to manage disease, and it can be nice to know all those disease. But it's important to note that despite everyone's best efforts, disease can still occur. Sometimes the weather rules. And that's really the case with Pat here, right? Granted, she didn't raise her mowing heights to my knowledge, so she kept helping it. But I told her when we were out there looking at it at the end of July, hey, when we get some cooler weather, we get some rain, these diseases will go away, your grass will grow back. Well, the problem is that infection period, that environment stayed good for a whole nother 2 months. And she just kept getting more and more and more, right? And this is a case where kind of my fault. I didn't understand what she wanted. She kind of took my answer of it will grow out of it. Excuse me. At face value, and it will grow out of it, and it still will grow out of it. But because the infection period continued, the environment was perfect for month plus afterwards. It actually kept getting worse, and she kept getting more and more unhappy. In the end, what did we end up doing? We ended up giving her a free fertilizer treatment. We ended up doing some overseeding in this area. And while some might say it was disease, it wasn't your fault. The homeowner doesn't necessarily look at it that way. They look at it as I have a problem and I want you to solve it. And so we did what we needed to solve it for them and retain them as a client. So kind of in conclusion here, right? Disease is going to be a natural occurrence. When we talk about that disease triangle, the pathogen's almost always present. The host is typically there. You're not going to change that. And so the environment is what's going to cause that disease to happen. And this is why understanding that disease triangle is really important. It's also important to say, okay, if I know the pathogen's there and the host is going to be there, what can I do with the environment to influence how much disease I get? And when we talk about that perfect lawn triangle, where we have the applications an applicator might make, we have the what the homeowner does to care for that lawn, and we have the weather, right? All of those things encompass in the environment. We need to have them in a perfect place in order to get the lawn to be perfect and avoid disease. It's important to know the customer's expectations, especially when you're going out to look at a diseased lawn. Some disease people don't really care about the disease. They just want to know what's going on and what's going to happen. So you can explain that and they're going to be happy. Some people want a solution, right? And this is where you can design solutions to meet that customer's expectations. My recommendation there is that we never how I say this, we never assume what they want, and we more try to provide a multiple solutions. So not only should you raise your mowing height, but you should change your watering, and we should do a disease program, and we should look at seeding. So multiple attack the disease from multiple different angles to get the best success. So I think that's it. I think this resource link will be available. We can definitely make it available, and I can throw it in the chat here for all of you. And we'll, go with some questions now to see what you might have from there.